It began with a whisper, a cough in a dark alley, a sailor collapsing on the deck of a Genoese ship, a merchant's cart that arrived in the marketplace carrying more than just spices and silks. No one could have imagined that in the span of a few short years, that whisper would swell into a scream that echoed across all of Europe, a scream of pain, terror, and death. They called it the Great Mortality. We know it today as the Black Death. Between 1347 and 1351, this invisible killer swept across continents, leaving behind a trail of unimaginable devastation. Whole villages vanished. Streets, once filled with laughter, became graveyards. The very rhythm of life itself was shattered. But how did it happen? How did one of the most terrifying events in human history begin? And how did it change the world forever? The story starts far from Europe, in the dry steppes of Central Asia. Here, in the heart of the Mongol Empire, traders and caravans moved goods and germs along the legendary Silk Road. Somewhere along these trade routes, a bacterium named Yersinia pestis found a home in the fleas that lived on rats. The perfect storm was brewing. Fleas, rats, humans, and trade. The arteries of civilization that carried wealth would now carry death. By 1346, the disease reached the Crimean port of Kaffa. The Mongol army, laying siege to the city, became dying in droves. Desperate, they hurled their infected corpses over the walls, perhaps history's first instance of biological warfare. Those inside fled by ship, carrying not just stories of horror, but the fleas that clung to their furs and sacks of grain. And so, aboard these doomed vessels, the Black Death began its voyage to Europe. When the ships arrived in Sicily in October 1347, the people who greeted them must have recoiled in terror. The sailors lay dying, their bodies covered with dark, oozing swellings, buboes as they would come to be called. Within days, the plague spread through the port city, and from there it moved like wildfire across the continent. Paris, London, Florence, Venice, no city was spared. The symptoms were unmistakable and horrifying. It began with fever and chills. Then black spots appeared beneath the skin. Painful lumps swelled in the armpits and groin, bursting with blood and pus. Within 3 days, death was almost certain. The stench of decay filled the air. They died by the hundreds, both day and night, wrote a Florentine chronicler, and all were thrown in ditches and covered with earth. But what made the Black Death so unstoppable wasn't only the disease itself, it was fear. Panic spread faster than the plague. People abandoned their families, fled their homes, and turned on one another. In the chaos, old certainties crumbled. Churches were overwhelmed with corpses. Priests refused to perform last rites. And when prayers went unanswered, faith itself began to wither. In many towns, people looked for someone to blame. Rumors spread that Jewish communities had poisoned wells. What followed was one of the darkest chapters of medieval Europe. Massacres, burnings, and persecutions carried out in blind rage. Fear made monsters of ordinary people. Yet, even in the midst of horror, humanity clung to life. Flagellants marched from town to town, whipping themselves in penance, hoping their suffering might earn God's mercy. In cities like Florence, doctors in long robes and bird-like masks stuffed with herbs walked the streets. The first plague doctors, armed with superstition rather than science. They couldn't cure the disease, but they recorded it, preserved it, left us their words so the living would remember what it meant to die in those years. By the time the plague began to recede in the early 1350s, Europe was unrecognizable. An estimated 25 million people were dead, a third of the population gone in less than 5 years. Some places never recovered. Others saw opportunity in the ashes. With so many dead, labor became scarce. Peasants could demand better wages, more rights, and fairer treatment. Serfdom, the backbone of medieval feudalism, began to crumble. The balance of power between lord and commoner shifted. Out of the grave of the old world, something new began to rise. Even the church, the most powerful institution of the age, was shaken. Its inability to stop the plague or explain it led to deep mistrust. People turned inward toward personal faith and self-reliance. This subtle change would one day give rise to the Reformation. Art and literature, too, were forever changed. The paintings of the late Middle Ages grew darker, obsessed with death and the fleeting nature of life. The skeleton, once a symbol of the grave, became a familiar figure in art, the dance of death, reminding all that no king, no pope, no peasant could escape the same fate. But here's the eerie part. The Black Death never truly left. It would return again and again over the next centuries in smaller waves, always lurking in the shadows. Each outbreak reminded Europe of that first cataclysm, of the fragile line between civilization and chaos. And yes, modern science has since uncovered its secrets. We know it was carried by fleas, transmitted by rats, and made deadlier by the conditions of medieval life: filth, hunger, crowded cities. And yet, even now, outbreaks of Yersinia pestis still occur in parts of the world. The disease that once destroyed half of Europe has not been entirely erased. What's most haunting about the Black Death is not just the death toll, staggering as it was, but the way it reshaped human history. It ended feudalism, transformed economies, rewired culture, and even paved the way for the Renaissance. Out of the darkness, Europe found light. Out of death, rebirth. Imagine walking through a medieval village in 1348. The silence so complete that the wind through the trees is the only sound. The world had ended, and yet somehow it continued. Humanity survived, scarred, wiser, and forever changed. The Black Death was more than a pandemic. It was a turning point, a reckoning. It forced humanity to confront the fragility of existence and the limits of power. And as history shows, it is in those moments, when the world falls apart, that it begins to rebuild itself. Out of the grave of the old world, something new Europe. And though centuries have passed, the echoes of that time still linger in our art, our cities, and in the lessons we carry whenever disease darkens our world again. Because history does not forget. It only waits to remind us.